Hello, everyone. This is Michael Voss, Dragon of the Southern Tier on No Soundbites Allowed. Today, we have a wonderful opportunity that we don't often get. Many people may recall that back on July 21st of 2021, I had done an article talking about DC and some of the policies that were being implemented there. Well, today we have the opportunity to speak with the gentleman, Mr. Addison Sarter, who actually created that policy and is continuing to work on that initiative. We want to give him the opportunity to speak with us and, in his own words, convince us in 15 minutes of the value of his position. And we want to give him that opportunity. And so we wanted to give him the opportunity to do just that. So without further ado, I do want to introduce Mr. Addison Sarter out of DC. And before we do anything else, Addison, if we can you first tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So DC born and raised. Currently, I'm working as a tenants' rights organizer for an organization called Empower DC. Also currently a student at Morehouse College out of Atlanta. And that's just rundown of me, 28 years old.
Yeah, you're a young man, but you've done quite a few things. In fact, as I recall, in 2019 and into 2020, you were running for the District of Columbia, the city council. Although you did, I don't know if you were disqualified or you were withdrawn. It's unclear, so I don't know. But you didn't go into the final race, although you had initially started on that. Was that did you withdraw from the race?
Oh, so obviously we know as of 2020, we had, COVID broke out and whatnot. So actually I was working at a shelter during that time. And so just the schedule change of having to work, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. at the shelter, and just I would say a lot of that combined with the COVID restrictions, because of those, mishaps, they allowed me to continue running as a writing candidate. So my whole motto was, my uncle's motto was, win or lose, there's pretty much no losing, because if you do lose, you still get your policies and ideas out that you think could better your community.
No, absolutely. I know that firsthand. I've run for Congress. I've run for county legislator. So I understand.
Awesome.
You can't always win, but sometimes you can get your message out there, and that can be just as important. So we don't look down at that at all. I hope it didn't come off that way.
Oh, not at all.
And I also know that you've been involved with the Medium. Now, this is what's generally considered a very left-leaning organization. Many different types of writers. You've been writing there. I see writing in November 18th of 2019, in particular, where you were first talking about your plan for an affordable housing in DC, which is the subject of today's discussion, as well as having another article from the April 2nd, 2021, the Historically Black Neighborhood Act, which falls in line with your current efforts, which I believe is essentially the same thing, but just a different title. Am I misunderstanding that?
I would say a different title, and I would say a more condensed version, because I think a lot of people may have seen it and have thought that, and no offense to you, but including yourself, have seen it and, just assume automatically that this was, like segregation. And so
yes,
I was like, let me just condense it a little bit, so people can be aware that this is indeed not segregation, but simply Black people having the chance to control the businesses and the real estate development within our communities.
Okay. And that's why we're here to hear that and see, I'm more than happy to say that if I've gotten something wrong, I like being corrected. I'd rather have the correct information than a misunderstanding.
For sure.
Now, to start off, there is a question you asked me before we started, and I want to make sure we get it on the record. So please go ahead and ask me that question again.
Yep. So the question I asked was, so do you believe that systemic racism towards Black Americans exists in 2022?
I don't believe it exists towards anyone, period, ever.
Okay. Enter. You said ever, like as in
Well,
it never
ever
existed?
in the modern history. I mean, if we're talking about 1860, absolutely. If we're talking about 1950, yeah. If you're talking about 1980 until 2022, no.
1982. Okay. All right. Obviously I definitely have definitely disagree with that, but we could if depending on however you would like to take the convo towards whether the initiative or this, it's up to you.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I was saying depending on how you would like to take the because you brought up the question, so I was just trying to figure out which one you would want me to elaborate on, the question of racism in 2022 or the initiative.
Well, we can probably do, well, we can do both, but I know that I want to make sure we have enough time to discuss. We're looking at about 30, 35 minutes. I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about your initiative. But yeah, I don't believe there's systemic racism. And I find it very difficult to believe that when I look at 16 to 17% of Congress is now individuals, just Black alone, not including Hispanics, women, Pacific Islanders. When I look at President Barack Obama not only being elected, but also being reelected, looking at members of the Fortune 500, I'm looking at individuals like Patrice Cullors, and so many other members of the BLM, Antifa, all these organizations, looking at college campuses where I speak at on somewhat regular basis, and listening to the various groups that are there, Progressive Leaders of Tomorrow. I can continue and continue and continue. I'm looking at opportunities in my lifetime. As an example, in 1970s, in 1976 to be exact, I had a family who had to come to my community. They came to my home because they were an interracial couple.
You said, could you repeat that? You said
sure. In 1976, a couple came to my family's home to stay because they were an interracial couple in the South. And so that was a difficulty. Today, walk outside the door in almost any community in New York, in the United States, and interracial couples aren't even a second thought. So to say that there's a systemic racism when I see observably in so many ways, things that have changed in my lifetime, opportunities that we thought in my lifetime thought would never happen are commonplace today. Yeah, I don't believe it.
Okay. So I would say, so what you did name, you named, and let me get this straight. I definitely believe that, there are millions of African Americans who do thrive in America. And what we can, go back to that as during slavery, there were, thousands of free Black people during the time of slavery. And so
in the North, yes. In the North, yes.
North, then there were some that would maneuver around through, Southern colonies or whatnot. But I say all that to say it's just you can have a certain class of African Americans who are thriving. Like that certain class doesn't mean that, there's a good amount of masses who are still subjected to that racial discrimination. So, because I think you said 16% of, I think you said congressmen, because 77% of Congress is, not mistaken, is white. So I would say, a few, tokens, or not tokens as if that's what they choose to be, tokens as in, as Malcolm X would call it, you do have a few, people who are in those pockets, but I say that, African Americans, we are a colonized ethnic group. And so colonization means another group of people assumes political control over another group of people. And so since we're
colonization, that's not a definition. That is a redefined version of colonization. but that's not
You're
colonization.
breaking up a little bit.
You're
There's,
freezing on your side. I
I'm,
see.
I'm, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, no problem. That isn't the definition of colonization. That is a political definition of it, but that's not the actual definition.
Yeah. Well, political. I mean, you can definitely, look up the definition for yourself. And even if that the political definition, then so be it as well. That's what we're talking about. Politics. So the political definition. African Americans are colonized. Even Dr. King mentioned this as well. I mean, Dr. King, isn't he that you would say you respect Dr. King. You love you admire what he did, and he was that go-to guy as far as the political mouthpiece for African Americans, and he even calls African American communities colonies.
Doesn't mean I have to agree with everything that he said.
Because he stated that when you're a colony, pardon?
It doesn't mean I
said
have
it's not.
to agree with everything that he says.
No, that's fair. I mean, he's someone who was actually there doing the work, the front line. So, I would say he's why you pretty much have the rights today that you have.
He's one of the reasons, absolutely. So is Malcolm X, Medgar Evans, and many, many others.
Medgar Evers, yeah, definitely.
So to say he's the only one, no. In fact, as Malcolm X had mentioned, part of the reason why they worked so well together, Dr. King and himself, and they were planning to do more work together, is that because Malcolm X was such a loud, squeaky fence, well, it made it much more palatable and much more easy for Dr. King to move forward because he had a much more moderate stance as compared to Dr. King. So
I definitely agree. JFK even said on his the audio tapes that he passed the civil rights bill because of the riots in Birmingham, and that they were fearful of quote unquote Negroes following after the Black Muslim movement. So I definitely agree on that
right.
aspect. But I mean, in the sense of Dr. King, he even stated that the civil rights movement was more so a middle class oriented thing, and that it didn't really do anything to remove the economic and racial barriers up north in our cities. So,
okay, well, that I do. I'm not really.
When he called it a colony, he was referring to the fact that he said, "You do what?"
Oh, I apologize, by the way. You're freezing on the screen, so it sounds like to me that you've paused.
Got you.
And that's why I'm speaking. Excuse me. And that's why I'm speaking. I do not mean to speak over you, so I apologize for that.
Oh, no problem.
So I'm going to try and make sure I give you an extra couple of seconds when I see you stop.
No problem.
Sure. But I apologize, but I know that's the past. And we both agree on the essential elements of the past. The individuals who were critical there, some of the things that they were saying, they have a lot of information they have said. We can go after one quote after another quote and try and look into it, but we generally agree on that. And we agree in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement took place, that there was a great deal of change. There was a sea change in America. Prior to that, there are many issues. Even after that, there are issues, but we have improved. And I think we have improved significantly, exponentially. But looking at today, I do not see how we can say that today, Black people in America are colonized or that they are systemically held back. I've seen it in terms of data on the middle class, in terms of data on education, and looking at the opportunities that are available to us and the ones that people take on a regular basis, and every aspect of our lives in the way we get to interact with individuals throughout this entire nation. I do not see the claim that you're making.
Okay. And if you don't mind me going back to Dr. King, what he said back then was the education system in Black neighborhoods, because of the lack of funding, pretty much has set a systemic, underclass. Pretty much we can all agree that inferior education means inferior jobs than another particular class. And so right now in 2022, white school districts receive $250 billion more than black school districts. And because of that, it's just creating a cycle of.
Where do you get that data from?
I could pull it up
Because it's
for
not,
you.
no one has ever defined it by white and black. You're talking about low economic communities, which include poor white people. And yes, having
That's not that doesn't include poor white people, because still America is still under obviously not as out in the open as Jim Crow, but it's still fairly segregated. So a lot of these poor white residents still have access to these white school districts, because rarely you'll find some poor white people in a black neighborhood, but for the most part, it's still fairly segregated.
And where do you get that data from?
Sure, I will show you right here.
Because I've looked at the data and I don't see that. There are poor communities, and there are people in poor communities across America that do have not the best education. Well, let me clarify that. By American standards, not the best education possible. There are reasons why we have voucher systems in private schools as well as public schools. And that is an issue, but that's not an issue defined by race. That's an issue defined by economics. And those economics apply to a swath of people. They're Asians, Hispanics, Blacks, and whites across this nation. In fact, by the numbers, I believe, and I need to double check, there are more poor people who are white in America than there are black.
Yes, well, that's also because America is like the majority of people in America are white.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at the percentage wise, Black Americans are disproportionately poor because of obviously the past 400 years or so. But we have from NPR and New York Times a report from the nonprofit
Which dates?
Which dates? So you have.
I'm going to verify. I want to read those articles myself because.
Sure, I'll definitely. And a lot of them are in the those mediums that you may have seen. So February 26th and 27th of 2019. And it is so it's, you can either I'll send you them all from New York Times, okay, NPR, and you send them to me.
You know what? We'll save time. You can just send them to me, and I will put the links up on the screen in the discussion so people will be able to see that and they'll be able to go there themselves.
Sure. And also I think we'd also like to dive into the banking and the housing. There's a lot of data I can send you on how still redlining still exists in the sense of control. When there are many studies that have shown when you control for economic, credit, income, education levels, that Black Americans are still denied mortgage and business loans double the rate of white Americans. And right there is that's you're basically denying a certain particular group of people access to wealth. So that is another form of systemic racism. Then that includes one of the reasons of my initiative. That includes the initiative in terms of where I'm from in Northeast DC. It's not just where I was from; it's all over America. How you have corporations that build these toxic waste factories in particularly Black neighborhoods, and it shows that the studies from New York Times that I'll send to you says that Black Americans are 75% more likely to live by these toxic waste industries. So that's just another way. And these toxic wastes also lower the property value of Black neighborhoods as well. And obviously, it's killing us. And it shows that this is controlling for all income levels. So this is all income levels, no matter if you strive for, you get your degree, you're a business owner. It shows that for all income levels, you will be denied a mortgage level, denied mortgage and home loans and business loans capital than the rate of other races. And back to, as I was mentioning with environmental pollution, it showed that even if no matter your income as well, you're more likely to be, victims of this environmental pollution based off, controlling all factors. So it's
I would dispute that because I don't believe that's correct data. And and this is a personal anecdote, but I got my mortgage. And what we see very often for people who don't get mortgages, white, black, Hispanic, otherwise, doesn't matter, is you're looking at what is their financial history. And I'm also a former stockbroker, did for a decade. I've done investments for people of every income strata. And what we tend to see, and this has also been in the various reports as well, we have individuals who are poorer tend to spend their money badly and have worse credit reports because they spend badly. They make fewer investments. And because they do that, that then reflects on their credit histories, which then impedes them in doing things in the future, like buying more homes or being able to buy create businesses. So that's one of the factors, and that's because of a way of thinking about finances. And in the Black community in particular, we have seen that there has been a large emphasis since 1992 in particular towards rejecting education to become more street, more gangsta.
Where would you say that data is coming from?
Where the data is coming from? The United States government.
Black Americans rejecting education.
Yeah, that comes from the United States government. It comes from
the United States. I'm sorry, you kind of blanked a little bit. You said the data that Black Americans are rejecting education to be street comes from the United States government.
That's one of the sources. There's been studies on this throughout the years. And
I don't think you'll find a study that will show that says that Black Americans make a conscious effort to turn away from education and to go the street route. That's just, you won't find a study of.
You don't believe that's true?
There will not be a reputable study saying that.
Okay,
so I would say that's a stereotype, I would say.
Okay, so you don't believe that there has been a movement towards, or that we've seen in entertainers looking at the entire rap industry, that we're looking at a promotion of violence and gangsterism, that we have in our communities kids that look forward to and are striving to become entertainers like LeBron James, or to be like P. Diddy or a Jay-Z, as opposed to a Dr. Ben Carson or a Herman Cain, which is a businessman, one of the bigger 500 CEOs of a 500 S&P 500 company. Are you telling me that if we went out to the street today, walked down any city in New York, in the United States, and stopped 10 kids between the ages of 14 and 18 and asked them, would they prefer to be a scientist, a doctor, or a rapper? Which one do you think they're going to pick?
It would be, if you at between 14 Black kids, is this any
14 to 18?
14 to 18? Is this are you going by a certain neighborhood, certain economic
anywhere
class?
In America. Anywhere in America. Anywhere.
I would say I would just, you mean, because it's obviously scientists. I would say, because that's like obviously a vague term. I would say career-wise, 14 and 18. I would disagree with the career-wise, meaning that the majority would want to be, I would say, rappers or entertainers. I would disagree with that, but I would also like to. That's a good point in terms of how you bring up the music industry, because all these record labels are controlled by, are basically owned by Europeans, white people. And rap used to be positive for the most part. And but we, Black Americans don't control it. So, if these, the Black community has been, marching for years to put an end to this gangster rap. You can look at
I know.
the honorable, C. Dolores Tucker.
I know.
Who's obviously, so, the African American community has been trying to fight against these stereotypes. You look at Michael Jackson, who used the K word on the radio for the derogatory name for, Jewish people.
Yeah.
And it was pulled off with quickness. So, but these white corporations allow a small percentage of Black Americans who are impoverished, who want to do whatever they can to get out, to rap about stuff that they've witnessed. So it's like it's an exploitation of a sense that you're exploiting a community of all the negative stereotypes, negative things that have happened against. We talk about the drugs and the guns in the Black community, but we got to mention the war on drugs. The administrative aide of Nixon, who declared the war on drugs, he said, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. But we could use the war on drugs to go after their leaders, arrest their leaders, and disrupt their community." That's what they said the war on drugs is about from the horse's mouth. So when you look at all of that, that's been 1971, Dr. King hadn't even been dead for for 5 years before they declare a war on a whole community that just got their civil rights. And so you have people, so you can't mention rap without mentioning Nixon declaring a war on the African American.
Actually, yes, you can, because that's not where rap came from. I'm old enough to know.
No, sir. I agree that that's not necessary. Rap came about of the economic conditions of Jim Crow.
That's not where rap came from.
It did.
No, that's not where rap came from. That's what it came about. That's not where it came from.
We're pretty much playing semantics. We know it came out. For African American music has always come about from the struggle of African Americans. Whether we have blues, jazz, James Brown, who some call the guy who said say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. So he's a godfather of hip hop. That many people will say. So that music has come about through the the racial obstacles we've had to rise above. But I know that it came from the Bronx. So specific. Some people may say it came from the Bronx, but we know it. That's what it came from. That struggle in America.
It came from the hip hop party, the house parties in the Bronx, and it was underground. And yeah, I know, because I was alive then. I was there.
Yeah, but there are many people who would disagree that hip hop and rap, that aspect of rap, has been around before then. But yes, the Bronx, they put with their equipment and the DJ, the turntables. Yes, that was an added thing. But rapping about the struggles of being Black and American, that's been around for a while. But what I mean in terms of today with the street culture, a lot of that is coming about from the drugs. You can't go a day without hearing about the dealing of drugs, but we got to understand that it's documented that the U.S. government was aware that drugs were being pumped into America, but instead of going after the head guys, they go after the low-level African Americans living in poverty, and so we have Nixon's administration, who admitted the reason why they declared the war on drugs was to disrupt African American communities and get rid of the civil rights leaders. I can
really
say that.
The biggest way to disrupt the African American community would be.
You froze right after I said. Okay. I'm sorry, you froze right after that.
That's right. One of the biggest things that would have really disrupted the Black community and has disrupted the Black community were the efforts of the war on poverty under Johnson, which was, some say, and I believe it was documented, that he was looking to make sure that the Black community would be disrupted by destroying the Black family, which has happened, and increasing the number of unwed mothers, which has happened, because it was the war on poverty, not the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a side effect of the initial factor, which is destroying the core of the Black family and taking fathers out of the homes, which then leads to everything else. Because when you don't have that discipline, when you don't have that leadership in the home, then everything else starts to fail because it becomes far more difficult to do the things you need, to have two parents, to have a two-parent income, to have that guidance and leadership, that example to follow. And so that becomes more and more of a problem. And that's where drugs come in, but drugs is not only is it a side effect of that, but it's also part of the 1960s flower power culture, which with Vietnam and the influence of drugs there, which again, isn't a Black issue, it's an American issue. But so
I definitely agree with you on the aspect of the war on poverty. Actually, Dr. King was very critical of the war on poverty. Many civil rights leaders were critical of the war on poverty. Dr. King mentioned how he disliked how it broke up Black families. And you talk about these black men who had to make these choices of, if I stay in this house, my family won't get the government assistance. And you have, so like I definitely agree with that aspect, because I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I'm independent. Even Dr. King's family said Lyndon B. Johnson played a specific role in his assassination. So I'm not a LBJ fan at all, because Dr. King actually was trying to push him to spend, I think, about $60 billion to $90 billion a decade on, the slums, the Black neighborhoods of America. And so I opposed to the war in Vietnam and how he warned us of the military-industrial complex. So I definitely agree that there was a effort of certain policies that destroy the Black family. That also wasn't the case when white people were experiencing poverty at higher rate. That whole fatherlessness thing started changing once Black Americans started receiving those benefits. And just a quick baseline, we got to look at Native American reservations. You look at them; they have similar statistics in terms of the violent crime rate. Violent crime rate there is twice the national average.
But one moment. That's a entirely different group with an entirely different discussion, because that's an entirely different history.
And I'll definitely show you how when you remove so they had the highest poverty rates in America, violent crime rate twice the national average. So it's like that shows that no matter what color you are, when you remove a group of people from their language, their land, heritage, keep them in poverty for centuries of years, commit genocide against them, like there is still going to be, chaos and dysfunction in those communities. So I mean, you would agree with that? You would agree with that, correct?
In part and partially, but that's a misrepresentation, because we can say the same thing about the Gauls. We can say that about the Franks. We can say that about the.
You said partially, and then you said we could say that about the Bronx.
Partially, and because we can speak about the Gauls, we can talk about the Normans. We can talk about.
Yeah, I'm talking about here. I'm talking about here in America on this American continent.
This is a worldwide event. The United States is not unique in this. This is something that we've seen throughout the world, where there are individuals who have been oppressed or suppressed for hundreds of years at times, and continuing forward, they move forward and improve themselves. And when given the opportunity, when they become part of that culture and that civilization, which we have seen happen in America as well. And again, there are many people we can point to that. Let me do something, because we're having an interesting conversation, and partially this is about perceptions based on knowledge of different aspects of history, partially because of our lifestyles of being alive. And I know
I just heard part of being.
So again, I was saying we're having a conversation that involves both perception as well as knowledge, as well as various sources of data. And some of that data conflicts. So let me take a step back for a second. And I do want to spend maybe the next half hour. I know you've given us extra time, and I do appreciate that. I thank you for it. I want to try and start, before we get to the DC initiative, let's define a couple of terms so we're on the same page. Because I think some of the terms that are used have different understandings, different meanings for people. One of the things that you have spoken about is a people. What defines a people?
A people? What defines a people? You mean like an ethnic group?
Well, as in one of the things that I've seen you cite before is the UN, some of the UN initiatives. And in that, and you've said, I believe it was it was both in April 2nd of 2021 and also on November 18th of 2019, that you mentioned that people should be able to self-govern themselves.
Correct.
Great.
Yeah, great question. So that United Nations source that was created during the decolonization movement obviously you had these colonized ethnic groups who are rising up, gaining independence. So it was particularly created for groups of people who were, colonized, who were under political control of another nation or another group of people.
So in that understanding of what a people is, what's the difference with what is a nation?
The difference?
Yeah, in the same context. So using that same context, what is a nation?
A nation, I would say a nation would be pretty much that people, because what a nation is and nationalism, has two different meanings.
Right. That's why I'm trying to define this, and I'm asking what's your definition?
Because I'm more so on the nationalist side of, the positive side, because we can all agree that Gandhi was a nationalist. We hear nationalism, we associate with white nationalism because white, a lot of people do media.
Not as many as you think, but okay.
So when you hear about nationalism today, CNN, Fox, anything, it's associated with white nationalism. But when we think of nationalism in a positive light, we think of Gandhi, who we all can agree was a man of peace, but he just wanted his people, the Indians, to be free from the political control of the British Empire. And I would say that's I'm from DC, very multicultural city. Some of my obviously close friends over the years have been white, people from all over the world. But in terms of achieving what's best for our people, we've seen that every colonized group of people has tried to gain their independence, including the quote unquote founding fathers of America. They wanted to gain their independence from the empire that they felt was, colonizing them and exploiting them or keeping them down. So I view it as a group of people who are experiencing exploitation and a certain persecution coming together to form their own, government, which aligns with the Declaration of Independence and whatnot.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, and I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So you're looking at the DC initiative and as a group of people, which is maybe be based on skin color, it may be based on culture, it could be a few different things that create a people. But more importantly, a nation would be defined by individuals like our founding fathers, who, when they had no redress from their government at the time, the United Kingdom, that they then sought their own government to be able to get that redress from government. And you're saying that that's the same thing that's happening in Washington, D.C., that Black people specifically do not have a redress to government and therefore must self-govern. Am I understanding that correctly?
I would say not just in D.C., but all over America, because Congress, who passes the laws, makes the laws and things, they're 77% white, we're under political control of Europeans. And these aren't just my ideas. Obviously, the thing we have to realize is that the Black communities, it's very diverse in terms of political ideas. We're taught that the Black community wanted to simply integrate with America, but you have many of activists, including Malcolm X's wife, after he was assassinated. She joined the Republic of New Africa and they wanted Black Americans to, the 5 states down south, as you may have heard, that where Black Americans were tortured on concentration camps in the South. They wanted those states for Black people to move there and assume political control there. So this isn't, something new. It's Black Americans have always been trying to have self-determination for a while. And I think how you mentioned before, how other groups, want to work hard and uplift themselves. And I don't know if you were saying that wasn't what has happened with Black people, but we've seen just like this initiative, Black Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Black community controlled everything in our community, and then they burned it down to the ground. There are many Tulsa, Oklahoma stories where Black communities have set up our own communities for us, governed pretty much
1920s,
and they were burnt to the ground. So
that was the 1920s.
Yeah, correct. 1920s.
Not 2000. That's not in 2000, 2010, 2020. That doesn't.
I never said they were.
I know. I'm not saying that you did. I don't.
I'm just saying that we have that history.
That history does exist, yes.
Of trying, we all weren't in 1960s as well. I said 1960s, how we were trying to form our own under the Republic of New Africa. And so this isn't anything new. These are all ideas of the Black community that have stemmed for hundreds of years before I've been on this earth.
Okay, so let me ask a question. You do not believe that Black people have the ability to get redress from the government at this time? Am I understanding that correctly?
I would say, if you look at, if a group of people are, I would go as far as to say that African Americans experienced genocide in America, because if you look at the definition of genocide, not my definition of genocide, the United Nations, and pretty much you have to have one of these following. It said in the 1948, after the Holocaust, the United Nations met and said, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, race, or religious group. And another thing, so it has killing members of the group, causing seriously body or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on a group of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures to prevent birth within a group, forcibly transferring children of the group into another group. And below you will see that it says that punishable acts, the acts that will be punishable, are complicit in genocide. And so we know that there's a lifespan, there's a gap of poor people and rich people. And so how we mentioned before, I think you may have jumped over it where you said, the denying access to loans has to do with financial history, but these studies are shown with how they've controlled for factors of credit. They said they control for all factors of income, credit history, and all of that. So if you're systematically denying a group of people wealth, I'm not saying all African Americans. The definition says in whole or in part. So if you're keeping a segment of the African American community in poverty, as Dr. King also said, he said that industries in America depend on a non-white cheap labor force. And so when Dr. King was assassinated, these policies did not die with him. So you have, for hundreds of years, you're systematically keeping a group of people in poverty. And obviously we know that poverty kills. You can look at all the science behind it that shows that poor people have a much shorter lifespan than wealthier people. So that's another form of something that we do not have redress in,
Okay.
which I would say genocide.
So I dispute the genocide because Black Americans aren't Black people in the world. Massive differences. I know
You
that
said Black Americans.
Black Americans are not Black people in the world. That's not the same thing. They're two different things.
There are Black people. Yeah, I agree that
Africans
not
are
all.
not Black Americans. They're not the same at all. Massive differences.
I do agree that African Americans are a unique people group in the sense of that, we were the only ones who didn't voluntarily come here. So and we're, stripped of our knowledge, language, heritage, and land. So I agree. To be called African American and Black, there are two definitions. But
okay.
I'm referring to obviously African American people.
But I just want to make sure this is not always necessarily just you and me. We were also talking to an audience.
For sure.
So we can't use genocide because all Black people aren't being killed around the world to be eliminated by the policies you're speaking about in America. So genocide is wrong on that level. Let me further mention that while I do believe there have been groups who have tried to eliminate Black people in America, in particular, Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, which looks to use abortions to be able to commit the eugenics and eliminate the Black population and suppress our ability to grow in America, which is documented. That is factual.
And the FBI.
The FBI has done a lot of things against a lot of people, but specifically, Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood were created for the purpose of eugenics, and they have been very effective at it. They have massively suppressed the growth of the Black community. That is a fact. We know the numbers of how many abortions happen. So if you're saying in that, okay, fine. But I don't believe that's redressing. That's one aspect, and it's not a genocide, but it is a suppression by a small group of individuals with great political power, not the people, and especially not in 2022. Going further, let me also mention that I don't believe to say that Black people, especially in cities like Chicago, New York, LA, DC, anywhere in America, but especially there, they do have the ability to redress. In fact, since 1967, we have had Black mayors in DC consistently. So we're talking about 55 years of Black leadership, Democratic Black leadership in Washington, DC, causing the problems that you're telling me that needs to be addressed. So sure. They had the leadership, they were voted in, they have been responding theoretically through a party that tells us that they are our ally, that they have our interests first and foremost. And in the 55 years that they have been in charge, things have only gotten worse. We have the ability to redress our communities. We can vote, and we do. And when we do vote, we can elect many people, including people like Barack Obama. But to say that, well, we need to be self-governing because we don't have access to the government or a redress of the government, that's factually not correct. And DC is the proof of it, amongst other places.
And those are, valid perceptions, but again, back to the great, Dr. King and paralleling how it's relevant to today. So in 1967, he said the majority of Black political leaders do not ascend to prominence on the shoulders of mass support. Most are still selected by white leadership, elevated to positions, supplied with resources, and inevitably subjected to white control. And so what he means by that is even till today, it was a Washington Post article, WAMU article that showed that when they looked at the campaign donations of political campaigns, they showed that the real estate developers who were getting all of this, land for literally a few dollars, that those are the ones who donated tons of money to these political leaders. So this is, and it goes back to colonization because
you're saying they're house Negroes.
You're saying that I'm just showing.
Well, I'm saying it for clarification. This is a common world clarification.
I'm saying it's indirect rule. So colonization, the aspect of colonization, they show that there is indirect rule. How the colonizer and in Africa and whatnot, they would set up how I'm sure you heard of Patrice Lumumba, how they would finance America's famous for doing this, the CIA financing a certain coup to pretty much be in charge and still rule over. So because there's a wealth gap in America. So obviously the white corporations have that wealth to donate more than African Americans.
Okay, so to be clear, in 2022, you are saying that Muriel Bowser, who is the mayor of Washington, D.C., you're saying that Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, we're talking about Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. We're talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Anna Presley, Representative Jeffries, that these are all individuals who have been bought, and that therefore their representation is false. By what you just stated, that's what it appears that
I would say the majority, as similar to what Dr. King said, the majority, because I can't speak individually on one by one all of those individuals without fully looking at their political reputation, their policies. But I would. What
about specifically? Let's focus on one that you would know: DC Mayor Bowser. She's in DC. You were running for the city council. She's in the Democratic Party. You ran as a Democratic candidate and then as an independent with a write-in. You're familiar with the politics of DC and know her. Is she bought?
I can't say. In my opinion, my opinion also aligns with the younger generation of African Americans in DC, which is that she has shown favor towards real estate developers instead of the native Washingtonians who've been living here for generations.
So you're saying she was bought, because if she's favoring them and she's receiving money for that or other favors, whether other remuneration, money and other things, if she's doing that as opposed to serving her people, then that would be a bought politician. Am I understanding that's what you said?
I would say there are some things that she's done in a positive light. So I can't say completely she's 100% under the total control of the establishment. But when it comes to things like such as gentrification and African Americans living in DC who are being kicked out of their homes, I would say she's, in terms of that aspect of land and the real estate developers, I would say bought in that aspect in terms of, and not specifically her. There are, DC council, many politicians who answer they have to make favors to corporations who donated money to their campaign.
And we can say this about, and I only point her out
because
individuals because they're nationally known and they are known to you.
DC, correct.
Right. So I'm not limiting it to them.
Right.
And there may be many politicians across America that I think we can go to many communities and people will say, this politician is corrupt or that politician's corrupt. I just want to make sure that we
Correct, for sure.
get an understanding of what we're talking about and who it might entail. So let's go back to your initiative. Let's get an understanding on, we've used this word a couple of times. And again, I want to define it so that we all are on the same page. Segregation, which some people call voluntary segregation. Many people find segregation to be racist. And in that understanding, they see the proposal you have made is racist. Individuals that might have that kind of opinion and have written about that, Martin Ostermuhle, who writes for the NPR out of Washington, D.C., a reporter and editor, is one of the more public critics. Can you tell us, what's the difference between segregation, whether voluntary or involuntary, and separation or self-governance as proposed by your bill?
Sure. And obviously the guy Martin from, I would say, I mean, I think he's, well, obviously we know he's, white and he could be from Sweden or whatnot. So I don't expect a white American to obviously understand my perception. So whether, I definitely did expect and anticipate, white Americans being opposed to this. But
I didn't mention he was white.
You said Martin. I thought because you went to his post and you could see right on there. That,
I know what I see. I never said it.
Like he's you pause right out.
No, I can see it.
Okay. Yeah.
I just never said he's white.
Got you. That's fine.
But I just find it interesting that was.
But that's a good.
Thing. But go on.
So Malcolm X defined separation. What he was advocating for, and something similar to with this initiative, he said that separation was when those in the community are controlling the economy of that neighborhood. For example, during segregation, obviously it was separate, but the white community still controlled the businesses and the real estate development in those communities. Whereas Malcolm X defined separation as, similar and still, we're living amongst ourselves, but we're controlling the institutions in our community. And even still till today, that's the aspect African Americans do. DC is majority Black, but only 7% of the businesses in DC are Black owned. And so it's, with this initiative, it's, and also to call something like this segregation, I think it's, because your relatives were descendants of slavery here in America.
I know on my mother's side of the family, yeah, we go back to about 1871.
So you can see how with this initiative where it's not preventing white people from living in these neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods are actually—
I disagree.
Segregated already. East of the river, when the area I was talking about is 90% Black. So it's like the same people who are angry at this, they don't care that these neighborhoods are already predominantly Black. But now that we want to control the businesses and real estate development in these neighborhoods, now it's an issue. That's very interesting.
One, I disagree that your initiative, as written, and now I want to be clear, I'm going off of your data, your explanation, November 18th of 2019, and your discussion of it again in April 2nd of 2021. Sorry, you may have jumped there. Did you hear what I was just saying?
You said going off my data of April 2021
and November
19. Right.
Now, there may have been additional changes more recently, and if I am wrong, please do correct me. But looking at that, it effectively is a segregation. It effectively does force individuals out of the community. As an example, in your discussion about the self-governance, you identify that a community of people would be able to democratically vote. and you do not clarify who are the people who would be registered to vote in that community. And you say that people would not be forced out. Well, here's the problem. If I am Black, Hispanic, Asian, white, doesn't matter, and I'm in that community you're speaking about, and I do not agree with the proposal that you have put in place, assuming that it actually passed and it went forward, and they do not agree, the only way that they can continue to have representation in their government, and the only way that they would be able to continue to have the rights they have right now, is they would have to leave that community. Because what you've proposed and what it entails does not coincide with the United States Constitution, the amendments, and the laws. That's why you're self-governing. You're not using those documents, that foundation, as part of the organization. So you are de facto causing people to be forced to leave because they wouldn't be able to exercise their rights any other way. As well as there's a question about who are the registered people who would be able to decide the doctrine of that community, which means that very likely, and it appears from the nature of the document, I could be wrong, that white people, Asian people, Hispanic people, Hindus, so on, would not be the registered people able to vote because you were concerned about corruption of the vote. So, and based on the document, it implies, I may be wrong, that white people at the very least would not be allowed to vote. They wouldn't be able to register, which means they have no representation in this self-governance that you are proposing, which again is de facto forcing them to leave the community to be able to have rights and to have redress of the government, as well as being, well, oppressive. Am I mistaken?
So I will say that on the aspect of not being, of us forming our own government under DC, that that would have to come about through a charter amendment of city council. And so the Board of Elections, obviously they were, involved in with, my my help with the proposal and whatnot. So that amendment has that aspect of the initiative has changed, but my confusion lies in the aspect, and that's just because of America's laws. Our founding father disagreed with certain laws, and they went to war to become independent. But obviously, that's not something or African Americans are not ready to take on the government for war. But I would say that in terms of how is that different with segregation and whatnot and not being allowed to vote, the Amish live, as my friend brought up, the Amish, live separately. Native Americans, I as an African American can't go to a Native American reservation and vote and control the businesses and whatnot and all of that. So if Native Americans are allowed to have their own reservations, I don't think there's anything wrong with African Americans, in theory, having our own reservations.
Okay,
because we were removed from our land.
Okay, let me address that. Native Americans had many wars. They lost, and it was part of their treaty, which is why they have in their own separate lands that were initially created when we took over, that we gave them those lands and they were autonomous. Now, they're American citizens by alignment, not by inclusion. And when I say that, I mean, they have an autonomous land, autonomous government and laws. And as an example, if you broke a law and ran onto Indian lands, you cannot be prosecuted. You would have to be extradited as if you were in a foreign nation. So they've always been sovereign and they maintain sovereignty. That's one group. You mentioned the Amish. Now, the Amish are not the same as the American Indians.
Oh, I agree.
And that's because the Amish, they have a religious community that lives close together. They're American citizens. They live under the laws of America, and they do not violate that. They have practices, their religious practices, their lifestyle practices that they choose to enact as a choice as part of the Constitution, the amendments, and the laws. But they cannot elect their own president.
So I agree the Amish and Native Americans are different in that. I was saying in the sense of them exclusively living amongst each other. Like we don't call that, we don't associate segregation with the Amish.
Because they're not segregated and they're not separated. You can go to the Amish community.
Similar to what this initiative was saying, you can come to these neighborhoods and things like that.
So it wasn't not the same. That's not the same in that. And again, I go back to the wording of it, and I want to be specific. If I am in that community, in the community, through some group of voters, whomever they may be, make a decision, let's say Second Amendment, I'm a big Second Amendment advocate, and in the community, if they decide no firearms are allowed, you don't have a right to be able to be armed, well, I am forced to leave the community because my rights are now being denied because they took a vote and said, I don't have that right anymore. And that is well within the purview of the document you have created. And it can do that multiple times on multiple aspects of laws, especially since it is not focused on the Constitution, but it's focused on the UN, a conglomerate that has many political objectives that have nothing to do with freedom.
The UN and the Declaration of Independence that states that whenever a government becomes too destructive, citizens have the right to alter or abolish it. So I would say the United Nations and the Declaration of Independence. But in terms of, you said like, different laws and whatnot, like I agree. So right now, what I'm talking about is simply, in theory, because, in DC, because it would have to take a charter amendment for that to happen. I'm simply talking in theory. African Americans, we've fought in every single war that's been in America. In fact, the first person to shed blood for this country as during the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks. So, and it's still today, it shows that Black people are represented in our military. But America, they didn't commit genocide against Jewish people during the Holocaust. That did not happen on American soil. Where the genocide of Black people in America happened on this continent, but America was able to help finance the homeland of Jewish people for a genocide that they did not take part in. So I'm saying if the former slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule, all of those acres of land could have been our own nation.
But they weren't promised 40 acres and a mule. That was from a general in South Carolina speaking about an island to a small group of individuals. That was not from the United States government. I understand it's very popular, and I understand it's been promoted, but that's not law.
No, I hear you. I agree that the government, as like the Congress and whatnot, did not meet specifically for, but this was a proposal from a Union soldier for former slaves. So, but to be clear, you're saying after slavery, you would have disagreed for the 40 acres and a mule?
No, I'm making sure that we're speaking about this clearly as a matter of fact and law, since we're talking about facts and laws. He didn't have the authority to do what he said. It is a romanticization of his statement that we see people going around saying 40 acres and a mule. It was never legal. We have no basis to it. If we did, people would have sued decades ago and would have won.
Why do you think people would have, you're saying people would have sued decades ago, as in which particular?
Because anyone could have sued. If that was an agreement bound by law, anyone could have sued and enforced that, and the Supreme Court would be able to have reviewed that and made sure, because that would have been a legally binding document, a contract. Contract law has no concern about people's color. And if you disputed it, you could bring it back into the courts, reinitiating that. Even if you want to say, well, it was the 1930s, 1980, 1800s, it was all corrupt then. You could turn around today, if it were legally binding, and go into court and have that same argument. And you can bring it to the Supreme Court today. And I say today because we're not racist today. We've seen, and we've been talking throughout this entire more than 40 minutes now. We've been talking about an hour, and we've seen the world has changed. America has changed consistently. You can go into a court today and fight that case. If it had any legal precedence, it doesn't.
And so that's referring to the 40 acres and a mule.
Yes.
So I would disagree on color, because it's a basic of not color, but lineage to a specific genocide. So it's not on a specific, it's not because of race, it's because of what is a demographic experience. But the Homestead Act, what that did was it gave millions and millions and millions of acres to specifically white people. Yeah, there are some people, but it was designated for white people. So, white Americans, that 40 acres and a mule, they got to have those benefits.
So, and I know we're running out of time here. So you're saying because someone else in the past did something, today, Black people should be able to do it.
No, you said you can't. You said it was illegal. When I was just saying we've done it before legally.
We did different things in the past, but hang on. No. Before we go any further, I want to stop for a second, and I want to pause because I think it's important to mention. Addison, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I respect that we have differences of opinion. I respect that you are willing to stand up for the values that you have and that you are willing to put them out there and to try and get legal action on them. I think that's very important. And I do respect that deeply, no matter how much we may disagree about the elements or the effect. I want you to know that I respect that. And I want everyone else to know that they should also respect you, even if someone disagrees in watching this, for either of us, if they disagree with either of us, to give the respect in any comments that we are willing to stand up and make our case and stand for the values that we believe in. I think it's very important, and I want to thank you. And I know you've given us extra time. I didn't expect it, but we're having I think it's a very good conversation on many elements that are affecting a lot of people. And I don't think people have a lot of honest conversations about that in politics, in the major news media, like we're having right now. So I'd want to thank you again for that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the opportunity and for you allowing me on the show to do that. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It is a tenet of for 15 years. I will always put people on who are respectful, to put out any point of view, whether I agree with it or not, and to let me hear what they have to say, to let everyone hear what they have to say, unedited, so that you will be able to present your best case. And then the public will make a decision. And that may happen in DC. I wish you luck to get this passed because you believe it will be effective. And if you can, do. I have no problem with that. And I want people to understand that. I would never try to stop you or hold you back from something you think is important. And no one should.
I appreciate that.
So we were leaving off on a thought of, and I want to be clear, past actions. It's a lot of what you're speaking about. Please, I may be wrong here, but I want to be clear. A lot of what you're saying seems to come out of critical race theory and its applications. It sounds a lot like that. It sounds a lot like what we've heard from Professor, what's his name? I forget his last name now. Darrell, oh God, I forget his last name, who created the idea of critical race theory back in the 70s. Ibrahim Kendi, who currently is a major advocate of critical race theory. It sounds like it has a lot of these elements which rely on looking at the past and saying, well, that past exists today in 2020, 2022, but yet everything else has changed. The world has completely changed in the last 54 years, 55 years of my existence. And to say that we are in the exact same place as then seems critical to the basis of what you're speaking about. Am I wrong in understanding that?
I would say that it's wrong in this aspect of the past, because during my time on here, you may have disagreed with the data and the statistics, but the data has showed that when you control for all of these factors that someone could say, oh, it's because of their credit history, oh, it's because of their job, oh, it's because of another issue about race. But when you control for all factors, it shows that Black people are denied access to capital and wealth double the rate as white Americans. And we have here from the Harvard Business Review that shows that job and hiring discrimination against Black Americans hasn't declined in 25 years. This was published the year 2017. And the way that, and this is again, controlling for all factors, income, education, background, all of that, it shows that even with candidates who have equal credentials are less likely to be called back due to just their names.
Well, let me clarify one thing on that, because I've said, or rather, when you mention it's controlled for all factors, who's controlling and what factors? How are they doing that? See, I look at that and I've seen, got every poll, I've seen study after study on so many things that have been put out, not just specifically this, but we can talk about almost anything in the nation over the last 15 years that I've been doing political commentary. And I know for a fact that you can control for anything to create any answer that you want. You can put out a poll and word it any way that you want to get any result that you want. So I have a what's the word? Skepticism when I hear that there is a study or a report from a very progressive organization or very progressive individuals that say they have controlled for factors that they don't necessarily define or clarify, that gives them a result that matches their political outlook. So yeah, I have a skepticism on that.
I see. So would you say you're less skeptical of it when reputable media platforms such as New York Times and the Washington Post releases this information? Because they have to, obviously proofread everything. And
no, they don't, and they aren't. No, New York Times is known for how many reporters that they've had, which made up their own stories. The NBC just announced last month and a half ago that they had multiple articles that were absolutely fraudulent. We just heard from Newsweek. They had to fire an individual for making dozens of stories, just fabricating stories. Rolling Stone has fabricated stories. To say that it's the New York Times, which 2.5 years it took them to verify a laptop that was already verified and already proven to be accurate. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's Hunter Biden. The fact is, the laptop was verified over 2 years ago, and they never bothered to do the to verify it because they had a political agenda. So to say I need multiple sources that clearly define what they are controlling for and how.
Sure, and I'll definitely send you those for sure. I'll definitely send you all of those. But that's from, and obviously those aren't the only two. That will definitely send more of those. But we can even look at the appraisal system, where they've showed just people's real lives. They've done tests where, and so the statistics show that Black Americans as a group, we lose about $156 billion in the appraisal system in terms of the devaluation of property. So you literally have people all speaking about how they've had one certain amount of prices for their homes, and they literally had to take out all the pictures of their Black family and put their white neighbor in place, and they shown just how much higher that home is valued when they're putting a white face in that. So that's just show, and some racism could also be unconscious.
But most appraisals don't look at the inside of the home. Most appraisals look at the outside of the home.
Yeah, and it's also revolving the neighborhood. So it's all and I'll send you the data from the Brookings Institute showing that, and it's called the segregation tax, and it showed that the valuation of Black neighborhoods have doubled since the 80s, and it's some of it is simply how they compute it with the numbers, but another aspect is that racial bias and how they look at something as just simply less than. And so $156 billion, that's in a decade, that's the Black communities losing trillions of dollars that they would otherwise be having in our community.
Again, I would say that's not the element of the problem. The problem is the financial knowledge, investment knowledge in the Black community, and that we are geared towards, that we as a community, as a culture, don't focus on investment. And homes aren't an investment. A home is a home. People use it as a vehicle for investment, but that's not an investment like a stock or a bond. Stocks and bonds, businesses, that's an investment. Totally different financial vehicle with totally different outcomes. And most people in your generation, and this is not a knock on you, please understand, but your generation don't know how to write a check. They don't know how to balance a checkbook. That's a problem. That's a financial knowledge deficit that will destroy your ability to grow wealth over time. And we've been seeing that not just amongst the Black community, the entire generation, last 2 generations, consistently. That is an American problem of our future generations. It's not just Black. I understand that may be your focus for your concern, and it is a concern for me too, but it isn't overwhelming because I don't isolate it to just Black people because white people did it. And this is why I ask, and I want to ask again, or rather I should ask, do you believe in critical race theory? Are you a proponent of that?
To this day, I still am a little confused on critical race theory because I would say, as a child, as a child, my parents always, they instilled, learning about the history of Black people in America. So this whole critical race theory, I don't think that and learning about your culture and the history of America, put it like this, Dr. King, only thing Black people really learned about Black culture in a history textbook in the grand scheme of things is that there was slavery, a paragraph about slavery, it was bad, and maybe a paragraph about Dr. King, and then boom, Dr. King was killed and everything changed and we're all living a post-racial society. And I think simply teaching the fact that that's not true and that there are still ways that Black people, and obviously the brown, obviously other races of color experience, I'm speaking about the disproportionate effect. Just simply teaching how Black people, how the systemic racism going on in America, just simply teaching how that exists. I just think that's a matter of, just justice, just simply teaching and just honesty.
Yes, I believe history is important. I believe accurately representing history is important. Like the fact that President Lincoln, a week before he did the 14th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, went out into the New York Times of the day and clearly stated that if he could keep slavery and keep the Union, he would have. Slavery was the
Lincoln.
That was Lincoln. Yes.
Yeah, correct. I definitely, yeah, I definitely never view Lincoln as the savior.
He's not a savior. He was just a man, and
yeah, I agree.
He was an abolitionist, but he was also a realist that he was looking to keep the Union together. Slavery was the fifth criteria on the actual Civil War. It was an economic war. It wasn't about slavery. We romanticize it to say it's about slavery. It never was. That was the fifth most important thing they were worried about. They had a lot of other issues well before dealing with the slaves. That was the last thing on the list.
So I would say it was about states' rights, and those states' rights were about the right to own slaves.
It was about states' rights, yes. And further down the line, it's about slavery. Slavery was not prominent in this as the politics of what was going on. It was literally the fifth largest criteria of all the issues they were dealing with. Economics, states' rights, federalism. There's a lot there. But, and again, I'm saying this to emphasize that the past, I agree. Let's have that investigation of the past. Let's have that honest discussion about it, like we should about the Holocaust, like we should about what happened for the Native American Indians, like we should about lots of things in the past. But at the same time, that's the past. The past does not predicate the future. Today, we are in a better position. Not only do I know that anyone who's been alive since the 1970s, we can document from the 1970s to today the multiple changes in our community, our culture, our nation, our economics that have improved. And I'm not saying they cannot continue to improve, but to say that it doesn't exist, I think is disingenuous. It creates a culture of victimhood that is actually counterproductive to some of the things that you want to see happen.
So I would say there's progress in the sense of I can go outside and go to a store without being turned away. But even, Dr. King and most civil rights leaders, they agree that the Civil Rights Bill did not do anything to change the economic conditions in terms of investment in Black neighborhoods and eradicate the slums. So, and I think this is from 2018, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of home ownership. 1968, 41% of African Americans own homes. 2018, 41.2% of African Americans own homes. Incarceration rate in 1968, 604 per 100K, per 100K, per capita, per population. 2018, that incarceration rate is 1730. Unemployment rate in 1968 was 6.7%. Unemployment today, in 2018, it was 7.5%.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Is there anything preventing you from building a business today?
Anything preventing me?
That stops you from going out right now, starting a business?
There is a aspect of another group of people having a head start in terms of capital. So you don't think
you're changing the criteria of the question. Let's start with the first question first. Is there anything preventing you or any Black person in America or any person of color going out today and starting a business?
Yes.
What is the factor that stops them?
One of the biggest barriers is access to capital, which is directly tied into the statistics, which you can analyze. And if you want, obviously we can agree to disagree on that aspect, but the numerous statistics show that controlling for those factors, Black people are systematically denied business loans.
Okay. So,
And we can go to in this year in Crenshaw.
mhm.
I think it was the Crenshaw Shopping Plaza, where the Black community, they rose up and actually raised more money than all other competitors for that lot, and they still gave it to another developer. So it's you're yes, there are Black people today who are, you can find millions. There are millions of Black people today who are able to, maneuver through the society and thrive and whatnot. But there's a chunk, as Dr. King said, there are industries that are dependent upon non-white cheap labor. And that goes back to white school districts receiving $250 billion more than Black school districts. Inferior education means inferior jobs. So that creates a cycle of an underclass.
See, and again, we're going back to the past of the 1960s. We're in 2022, not same world. Not
that we're speaking in terms of the funding today in 2022.
I understand. And I believe that people can get the funding. Now, I don't know the Crenshaw story that you're speaking about. So I can't speak on that intelligently. So I don't know the factors involved there or anything. Sure. And I'm not disputing that you're correct. I just don't know anything about it. I can't comment. What I can say is, under the same criteria, an individual who has the money or has the access to the money, which is possible, and that can be done as a community, you can go out and get a GoFundMe, that they are able to go out and start a business. In fact, you can start a business without any money. I've never been not a rich man, middle class most of my life, rose up to middle class. I've started businesses and it costs $120. Literally, you can start a business tomorrow, right now, $120 online, and you can do it in 2 hours. So, and anyone can do that. We've seen individuals. I'll give you another example of where I'm going with this. BLM, Patrice Cullors, raised $66 million. She spent how much of that on buying housing for the Black community? Not for herself, which we know she owns several mansions in Canada and throughout the United States, 5 for herself and her family. There's one for the BLM offices, essentially, which is a private home for another individual closely collected to her, $800,000 for her brother to do security. How much was spent on housing for the Black community?
I really don't follow. I've been aware of the mansion she's bought, but that the Black Lives Matter as a slogan, as Black Lives do matter, and that there is police brutality in America. I agree with that slogan, but I don't agree. I wouldn't say I'm a fan or even affiliate of the Black Lives Matter organization.
I'm not saying that you are, and I don't mean to. I'm using them as an example, not necessarily for you, but an example of what I'm making. That we are looking at examples where we have individuals who are more than capable of being able to help promote ideas that you're talking about, and they don't. Oprah, she opened up her school in South Africa. What's she doing in America? LeBron James. We can go down a list of many people who are very wealthy, who are Black, and they're not doing anything.
So LeBron James' school, I would say that's starting a school, I would say that's pretty big.
One school, and he could do more, and he could do much more. Now, I'm not going to say that they have done nothing. I don't mean to make it sound like that. But collectively and individually, to achieve the goals you're speaking about, they could do more. And yet, I don't hear you saying to them, why have they failed the Black community? Because they're not supporting issues that you're talking about. They're not creating the environment you're speaking about. They could. Oprah, LeBron, and Patrice Cullors collectively could put their money together and buy out a huge swath of Indiana, Kansas, Nebraska, upstate New York, and create whatever community they want to. They could create a brand new town overnight, easily. Islamburg, New York, is becoming a town slowly. They're building the process. It takes time. They're a hamlet right now of a Muslim community, perfectly fine. And they're bringing people together. And eventually, when they get enough people to go from a hamlet to a town, they'll be able to seek recognition as a town. Tomorrow, those three individuals, and I'm just picking those three, we could add more, and all the allies that they may have, like a Warren Buffett, a Bill Gates, a Jeff Bezos. Let's go through the whole list.
And you were speaking about a specific state, to fund a specific state or a nation?
I'm talking about a state.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not even talking a state, a city. They could put together a city overnight. And in that city, they could elect officials that would get recognition by the United States federal government, that would allow them to have Black figureheads leading by example to do all the things that we want them to do.
I agree to an extent, but why should I hold basketball players to a higher standard than elected officials?
No, I hold them I hold them at a far lower. They're meaningless. They're entertainers, in my opinion.
But I agree on your aspect of this is something, and people people have been saying this for years, that a lot of these entertainers do not represent our best interests. So I agree to an extent that more can be done. But, and again, this goes back to the aspect of how we talked about, genocide. And we have, I think it was William Sullivan, who was an assistant to J. Edgar Hoover. And he was talking about Dr. King, and he said, we could remove him off of his pedestal. That way it would lead Black Americans from being led in the proper direction. And there's not too many ethnic groups where the FBI has said, we want to literally saying we want to prevent this race of people from moving in the proper direction. Obviously, you have back in the day where you had the colonists talking about wiping out Native Americans, but in modern history, which I would say the 60s is modern history, of literally a government entity saying they want to prevent a specific people from moving in the proper direction. And you have the counterintelligence program where you're obviously aware of the COINTEL program that pretty much said prevent the rise of a Black Messiah who could unify the masses.
It wasn't. COINTEL is not about Black people.
It wasn't specific, but they said that about 90% of the sources of funding towards J. Edgar Hoover's funding went to Black organizations, towards TART. So that aspect of, you may lose me right here, but there are many African Americans who, put it like this, almost a year ago today, and you might even agree, former Michael Brown from Homeland Security, FEMA, he said on his show that I was an enemy to America. So it's a very, within the African American community, there is a fear that if you do try to do good for your community, you will be killed or targeted. I've had
get that all the time.
Real estate, and so there is a fear.
I get that all the time, and guess where I get it from? BLM, Progressive Leaders of Tomorrow, also known as PLOT, Democratic Socialists. I get this. I understand that anyone who's stepping up, especially in the Black community, that says, hey, I have this idea, they get death threats. I get death threats from the left, from progressives. I have video of them trying to attack me, to assault me verbally and otherwise. I've had them call me every name in the world because for the simple fact that I am a Republican conservative. Nothing else needs to be said to these people very often, and they will try and physically attack me. And that's part of the problem, because I don't think you should be attacked for having a different idea. I shouldn't be attacked for having a different idea. I don't believe in that. but that's not what we're
So
seeing.
so I see that that was one of the reasons for why you saying, why aren't more Black people doing more? Some people say Jesse Jackson, you know, that's something you hear that, oh, he turned his back on the community, but it's just, you got to look at it where Jesse Jackson's literally next to his he watched his mentor getting shot down like a dog, Dr. King. So there's just that fear, that fear of, that's why many people don't try to put it like this. In the Black community, they'll let you do things like pass out turkeys on Thanksgiving, such and such. But the moment you try to control a certain industry, control your own community, that's where, because essentially if the initiative that I'm talking about were to get done, where the simplified aspect of just simply the majority of business owners in a Black community and developers, residential property owners in a Black community should reflect that population. If that were to get done, that would be removing millions and billions of dollars from these white corporation developers. So it's just, a lot of Black people do not want to speak out. That's why a lot don't want to do, and also they're millionaires. They're living a life of luxury, so it's hard to.
See, and I disagree to an extent. I do understand lots of people. We know there's been lots of polling. There's been lots of documentation saying that the majority of Americans feel like they can't speak up. All people, all different colors, everywhere in America, unless they happen to be progressives. There's actually a poll showing that. The only people who feel like they can speak freely today, 67% of the time, are progressives. So I think it's a political ideology that's holding and repressing some people, which doesn't apply as much to celebrities, entertainers, politicians. But let me do this. We've been on a long time, and I do appreciate this. I want to give you 5 minutes. Okay. We've got about 9 minutes left. I have to do another meeting, but I want to give you 5 minutes. Sell me on, let's say your initiative goes through. Give me a 5-minute sell. This is what's going to be the consequence. What are the results of doing that?
Sure. So keep in mind the aspect of the own government aspect. That aspect has been altered. So just on this initiative now, what it is today, it is, so a sell on that is, for example, the toxic waste industrial sites that I mentioned. So DC government funded $14 million for a toxic industrial site to be built in my childhood neighborhood for one site, and then $22.5 million for another site. So if this initiative were to pass, this is what it would look like. It would simply mean, instead of funding to destroy our neighborhoods, why not fund Black people from that neighborhood to build institutions that could uplift the community. And so Dr. King, Stokely Carmichael, they all said one of the main reasons why Black communities remain poor is because the business owners and owners of the property were non-Black. So pretty much at the end of the day, they take all that wealth out of the community back to where they live. So the owners of the public housing in my childhood neighborhood are from Bethesda, Maryland. So they take all that wealth and millions of dollars and they bring it to Bethesda, and nothing gets reinvested back into the community. So it's just simply ensuring that Black communities just control the institutions in our communities. I believe Asians, in fact, there are many Chinatowns throughout America where the Chinese control the businesses in their neighborhoods. But a Black person couldn't just, and many people said this before, a Black person couldn't just go to a Chinatown and open up a Chinese store. It just wouldn't go culturally to them. The majority of businesses in all their neighborhoods, they get to control the economy in their neighborhoods. So it's simply a matter of us controlling the institutions in in our communities. If white people want to live there, great, they can live there. It's just if this is a Black community is already predominantly Black, then what's the harm in allowing those people from those communities to simply control the institutions there, and ensuring that the wealth stays in those communities? Because if that were to happen, if this were to happen, these like property taxes in the school system, it would obviously increase funding for our neighborhoods, because all this tax base is staying in our communities. So it's not about, I believe all races of people should control the businesses in their community. Go for it. But unfortunately, we don't see this with the Black community, whereas in DC, 7% of businesses in DC are Black. So it's just a matter of people wanting to control their neighborhood.
Okay, and apparently they haven't so far. They haven't wanted to do that.
Have not wanted to do that?
Yeah, that's why there's 7% instead of 75.
Well, we obviously disagree on the systemic aspects that prevent, because you mentioned the aspect of money in businesses, and anybody can just go and start a business, which I agree, there's opportunity out there, but it even shows that the stats show that the majority of business owners, regarding all races of people, not just Black and white, all races, the majority of their funding comes from the personal savings and their families. So if you have a group, I know that you, even let's just say that your perspective is right, that, after Dr. King was killed, everything, we're living in a post-racial society. Still, that's more years that Black people in America, if the cutoff date is 68, that's still, you would agree that that's still a main reason for the wealth gap. Because to say that slavery and then a century later of being denied access to wealth has nothing to do with the wealth gap,
I don't care about the wealth gap.
And then that's what we're talking about. I'm talking about the business,
about the future. I don't care about the past. There's a wealth.
No. Okay. And that's we're talking about entrepreneurship and businesses.
Yeah, but
and so if the majority of business owners, pull from their family wealth, and so if one particular race of people had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of racial preferences giving them access to wealth, of course their family will have more wealth to help them start a business than the family that just got the right to.
That's not necessarily true. And we can look at how many 7-Elevens, and I know this is considered a stereotype to some people, but it's also true. How many 7-Elevens have been started by individuals from India, because the family roots together, put their money together, and they buy a 7-Eleven. Then they buy a laundromat. Then they buy a bakery. We've seen that in many different types of peoples all across, including Black people from Africa, including people from Asia. We're talking about all around the world, come to America, put their money together, looking at Chinatown, looking at Little Korea, where we see these individuals group their money together, build up a business. The next business goes to the next person in the family, and so on and so on. It can be done. It is being done, and we don't need to change America to make it happen.
I think we're doing, because I've definitely heard that myth that, immigrants and other races come here and work harder, but we don't take into account of the selective recruitment within the immigration population. For example, how you mentioned the Indians that come here, the majority of Indians that immigrate here, they come with these college degrees and advanced degrees.
You don't need a college degree to run a 7-Eleven.
But what I'm telling you is that they're picking. You can't compare a population that is selectively recruited to come here to, because if that's the case, if you compare their whole population, it doesn't match up in terms of, it's not about a matter of work ethic, because the majority of Chinese people do not have bachelor's degrees back in China. It's poverty in India and China. So we can't necessarily compare immigrants and African Americans.
We can, because it still holds.
And also, they've come here with capital.
No, that's not accurate. That's not accurate. You're thinking of H-1B visas as opposed to individuals who are coming through the immigration process. But
no. That is.
I only have a minute left.
They're undocumented immigrants. Those are the ones that may not necessarily come here. I'm talking about those that legally come here.
I'm talking about legally. I'm talking about legally.
So there's a selective.
But we have less than a minute. I don't want to cut you.
Got
you. Where can people go to find out more information about what you're offering?
You can definitely subscribe to the Medium, where I have updates on the process.
Okay, I will include that link.
So also you have that link, or my Instagram at Addison Sarter, where you can follow the updates on that initiative as well.
Okay, I'm only rushing because I know we're going to get
no worries.
for a second, but
for sure.
I want to, again, I thank you for